As you listen, you will learn, not just about the universe, but about English. The words are simple. The sentences are clear. The rhythm of the story will guide you. You will hear new words, new ideas, and new ways to express yourself. You will learn the language through the power of storytelling, through emotion, through real events. And with each chapter, your understanding will grow. Close your eyes and imagine a young boy lying on the grass looking up at the night sky. He wonders, what is out there? Where does the universe begin? Where does it end? This is where our story begins. A story of a boy who never stopped asking questions. A story of a man who changed the way we see the universe. This is not just a story about science. It is a story about strength, about never giving up, about fighting even when the world tells you to stop. Stephen Hawking did not walk through life, but his mind traveled farther than anyone else's. He was told he would die young. Instead, he lived for decades, proving that nothing is impossible. You will hear about black holes, about time, about space, but you will also hear about love, struggle, and hope. You will feel the weight of his challenges. You will celebrate his victories. You will follow his journey from a small boy in England to the most famous scientist in the world. So, sit back. Listen closely. Let the words take you on a journey through time, space, and beyond. Because in the end, this is not just Stephen Hawking's story. It is yours too. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Loved the Stars. In a quiet town in England, on a cold winter morning, a baby's first cry filled the air. The year was 1942. His name, Stephen William Hawking. His parents, Frank and Isabel, were both thinkers, lovers of knowledge. They believed in education, in ideas, in asking big questions. But they had no idea. Their son would ask the biggest questions of all. Stephen was not an ordinary child. He was curious, always curious. While other children played outside, Stephen sat and watched the sky. Why did the stars shine? What made the universe so big? He wanted to know. He wanted to understand. At school, Stephen was not the best student. His teachers expected more. His handwriting was messy. His tests, often late. But there was something different about him. He could see patterns, connections, ideas that others missed. Numbers and theories fascinated him. His mind was fast, even if his hands were slow. His classmates gave him a nickname, Einstein. They said it as a joke, but deep inside, Stephen liked it. He admired Einstein, the great scientist who changed the world. Maybe, just maybe, he could do the same. His father wanted him to study medicine, but Stephen had other dreams. He wanted to study the universe. He wanted to understand time. He wanted to find answers to the questions that had no answers yet. At home, books filled every corner. Old books, new books, books about science, mathematics, and history. His family was not rich, but they were rich in knowledge. The Hawkings believed in thinking, in discussing, in exploring ideas. Even dinner was a time for learning. While most families talked about daily life, the Hawkings talked about atoms, space, and the future of mankind. Stephen listened. He absorbed. His world was bigger than his small town, bigger than England, bigger than Earth itself. One day, Stephen built a small computer with his friends. They used old parts, wires, and a lot of imagination. It wasn't much, but it worked. He loved creating things, solving problems, discovering how things fit together. As he grew older, his dreams grew bigger. The sky was not just blue, it was a mystery, and mysteries were meant to be solved. He knew he had to study science, to learn more, to go deeper. At 17, something incredible happened. He was accepted into Oxford University, one of the best schools in the world. It was exciting, but also terrifying. He was young, one of the youngest students there. Could he keep up? Would he succeed? The future was waiting. The stars, the universe, the great unknown, all of it called his name. And Stephen? He was ready to answer. Chapter 2. A Curious Mind at Oxford. At just 17 years old, Stephen Hawking walked through the doors of Oxford University. The ancient buildings, the grand libraries, the long echoing hallways. It was a place of history, of great minds, of brilliant ideas. And now he was part of it. He was one of the youngest students. The others were older, more confident. They had studied longer, knew more. But Stephen was different. His mind worked fast, faster than most. He could see answers before others even finished the question. Yet, something was missing. Oxford was a place of tradition. Students followed rules, studied books, memorized facts. But Stephen wanted more. He wanted excitement. He wanted challenges. He wanted to explore the mysteries of the universe, but instead, he was bored. He often finished his work quickly. Sometimes he didn't even try. He would stay up late, talking with friends, debating ideas, making jokes. He loved laughter, loved fun. He was serious about science, but not about rules. His professors wanted him to work harder. He wanted to do things his own way. Then, something strange happened. At first, it was small. His hands didn't always listen to him. He dropped a pen, then another. He stumbled on the stairs. His voice felt weaker. His body was changing. Was he just tired? Was he not eating well? He told himself it was nothing. But deep inside, a shadow of worry began to grow. The problem didn't go away. It got worse. His movements became slower. He struggled to button his shirt. He tripped over his own feet. Once he fell in the street. People helped him up, but he felt something new that day. Fear. Still he kept going. He was stubborn. He ignored the signs. He told no one. He focused on his work, on physics, on the universe. If something was wrong, he didn't want to know. Despite everything, he was brilliant. His final exams arrived and he barely studied. Instead, he walked into the exam room with quiet confidence. The test began. The questions were difficult, but he didn't panic. He thought. He calculated. He answered. When the results came, they were extraordinary. His professors were amazed. He was offered a place at Cambridge to continue his studies. A new chapter was waiting, a new adventure. But there was one problem. His body. It was weaker than before. The falls, the shaking hands, the slurred words, they were not going away. Something was wrong. And soon, he would have to face it. Chapter 3. The Terrible News. The halls of Cambridge were filled with energy. Young minds worked, debated, and dreamed of discoveries. Stephen was one of them. He had big questions, bigger ideas, time, space, the universe. He wanted to understand it all, but something else was happening. Something he could not explain. His hands trembled when he held a pen. His feet felt heavy when he walked. His speech slower. His voice weaker. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe stress, maybe tiredness. But deep inside, he knew the truth was different. One morning he fell. It wasn't the first time, but this time he couldn't get up right away. People helped him, asked if he was all right. He laughed it off, said he was just clumsy. But the fear inside him grew. His father noticed. His mother watched him carefully. They worried. They told him to see a doctor. He didn't want to. Not yet. But the day came when he couldn't ignore it anymore. The hospital was cold, the air thick with silence, tests, questions, more tests. Doctors spoke in quiet voices. Hours passed. Then the moment came. The doctor sat in front of him. His face was serious. The words that followed hit like lightning. "You have ALS, a disease that will slowly paralyze your body. You may have 2 years to live." The world stopped. 2 years? Just 2? He was only 21. His life was just beginning. The universe was waiting for him. And now, this? He felt numb. He heard the words, but they didn't seem real. The doctor kept talking. The disease would weaken his muscles. His movement would become harder. One day he might not be able to walk, to talk, even to breathe. There was no cure, no treatment. Stephen left the hospital in silence. The sky was gray, the wind cold. The world around him moved as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything was different now. He sat in his room for days. He didn't speak much. He didn't study. What was the point? If he only had 2 years, why bother? His dreams, his future, all fading away. Then, something happened. He thought about the universe. He thought about time. He thought about life itself. 2 years? Maybe. But 2 years was still time. Time to think. Time to learn. Time to live. He would not give up. He would not waste the days he had. If he was going to die, he would die fighting. Not with fists, not with anger, but with his mind. Slowly, he returned to his work. He picked up books again. He asked new questions. If time was running out, then he would make every second count. And so, the fight began. Chapter 4. Love in the Darkest Times. The days after the diagnosis felt empty. Time moved forward, but Stephen felt stuck. The doctors had spoken. The future had been written. His body would weaken. His muscles would fail. The world he knew would slowly slip away. He tried to hide his fear, but it was always there. Every morning, every night. A shadow that followed him. His friends noticed the change. He was quieter, more distant. He smiled less. He spoke less. The once lively debates, the endless questions about the universe, now they felt pointless. Why think about the future when there might not be one? Then he met her. Jane Wilde was a student at Cambridge. She was bright, full of energy, full of life. She had dreams, hopes, and a love for poetry. When she looked at Stephen, she did not see illness. She saw a brilliant mind. She saw a young man with fire in his heart. A man who had something important to give to the world. She was kind. She listened. She laughed at his jokes. She did not pity him. She did not treat him differently. She saw him, not the disease. At first, Stephen did not know what to say. Why would someone like Jane want to be with him? He had ALS. His body was failing. His future was uncertain. He told her she should not waste her time. But Jane disagreed. She was not afraid. She believed in him. She believed in their love. Slowly, things changed. Stephen felt something he had not felt since the diagnosis: hope. With Jane beside him, the dark days did not seem so dark. The future did not seem so empty. She gave him strength. She gave him a reason to keep going. They spent hours together. They walked through the streets of Cambridge. They talked about books, science, music. They shared ideas, dreams, secrets. Jane was patient. When Stephen stumbled, she held his arm. When he struggled with his words, she listened. His body was changing, but his heart was alive. Love gave him courage. He did not want to waste time. He wanted to live. He wanted to learn. He wanted to fight. He returned to his studies with new energy. The universe still called to him. He could not ignore it. He had questions that needed answers. Black holes, time, the beginning of everything. He could not stop now. The disease moved slowly, but it moved. His hands grew weaker. His voice became softer. Walking became harder, but Jane was always there. She never let him fall. She never let him give up. One day he made a decision. He asked Jane to marry him. He had no money, no house, no future he could promise. He had only himself, his love, his mind. It was not much, but it was everything he had. Jane said yes. Not because she felt sorry for him, not because she was afraid to be alone, but because she believed in him. Because love is not about perfect bodies or easy lives. It is about standing together, even when the road is hard, even when the future is unknown. They married in 1965, a simple wedding, a small church, friends, family, a day full of laughter and hope. Stephen smiled more than he had in years. He had found something greater than science, something even more powerful than the universe itself. But life was not easy. The disease did not stop. The doctors had warned him. His muscles continued to weaken. His speech became harder to understand. Simple things became difficult. Writing, eating, walking. Everything took effort. Jane took care of him. She learned to understand his words, even when others could not. She helped him dress, helped him move, helped him live. She did not complain. She did not walk away. Stephen worked harder than ever. His mind was faster than his body. He knew time was precious. He needed to make every moment count. He studied, researched, wrote papers. He developed ideas about black holes, about time itself. He was not just surviving. He was achieving. But the world was not kind. People stared, some whispered, some thought he should stop working, stop trying. But Stephen ignored them. He had too much to do, too much to discover. His professors were amazed. His ideas were new, bold, different. He was changing the way people thought about space, time, and the universe. He was proving that even a broken body could hold the most brilliant mind. There were hard days, days when the pain was too much, days when he was exhausted, days when fear returned. But Jane was always there. She reminded him why he started. She reminded him that he was more than his illness. Years passed. The disease moved slowly, but it never stopped. Stephen's body weakened, but his mind soared. His name became known. His work was respected. He was no longer just a student. He was a scientist, a thinker, a force of nature. He could not walk. He could barely write. Speaking became difficult. But he refused to stop. Because love had given him something precious, a reason to fight, a reason to live. The doctors had given him 2 years, 2 years to fade, to disappear. But Stephen had proved them wrong. He had married, he had studied, he had made discoveries. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 5. A New World of Black Holes. Stephen sat in his study, lost in thought. Numbers filled the pages before him, equations stretching across the paper like a secret code. His hands trembled as he wrote, his muscles weaker than before, but his mind was stronger than ever. The questions never stopped. The universe was full of mysteries, and he was determined to solve them. Black holes, enormous, powerful, invisible. For years, scientists believed they were like traps, swallowing everything that came near, never letting anything escape, not even light. They were the darkest places in space, impossible to understand. But something about them didn't feel right to Stephen. There had to be more. There had to be a way to see beyond the darkness. He thought about energy, about space, about time itself. He imagined the universe in ways no one else had before. And then it happened. A new idea. A discovery that would change everything. Black holes were not completely black. They were not just voids in space, not just endless traps. They were leaking. Tiny, invisible particles were escaping, bit by bit, slowly but surely. They were losing energy. And if they lost energy, then one day, far in the future, they could disappear completely. This was shocking. It went against everything scientists had believed. No one had ever thought of this before. But the math was clear. The logic was strong. The answer was there, written in numbers and symbols only a few could understand. The idea was new. It was bold. It was strange. Some scientists doubted him. They asked questions, demanded proof. Could he really be right? Could black holes truly fade away? He was sure of it. This discovery became known as Hawking radiation. His name was now part of the universe itself. He had changed physics forever. His work was studied, tested, debated. Scientists around the world were amazed. Some disagreed, some celebrated. But no one ignored him. Stephen could not walk. He could not move without help. His speech was becoming slower, harder to understand. But none of that mattered. His mind was free. It traveled to the farthest corners of space. It explored time, energy, and the very nature of existence. He had done something incredible. He had found light inside the darkness. He had given the world a new way to see the cosmos. And he was not finished yet. His work became famous. People outside the world of science began to hear his name. He was no longer just a man in a wheelchair. He was a thinker, a dreamer, a man who refused to let limits define him. Black holes had once been the most mysterious objects in space. Now, thanks to him, they were understood in a new way. They were no longer just monsters. They had secrets, and Stephen Hawking had unlocked them. The journey was far from over. There were more questions to ask, more discoveries to make. The universe was waiting, and Stephen was ready. Before we begin Chapter 6, A quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. The Wheelchair Genius. Stephen's body was changing. Walking had become impossible. His muscles no longer followed his commands. The effort to move, to stand, to take even a single step was too much. The wheelchair became a part of his life. At first, he resisted it. He did not want to depend on it. But soon, he had no choice. His mind, however, remained as sharp as ever. Ideas raced through his thoughts faster than his body could move. He worked harder, pushing the limits of what seemed possible. His discoveries continued. His research expanded. The universe still called to him, and he refused to stop. Every day was a challenge. Simple tasks became difficult. Holding a pen, typing a sentence, even lifting a spoon to his mouth. But he found ways to keep going. He used technology, tools, and the help of those around him. His determination never faded. He had too much to do, too many questions to answer, too many mysteries to explore. Then another battle began. His voice, once clear, once full of energy, started to weaken. The words he wanted to say no longer came easily. Conversations slowed. Speaking became exhausting. His world became quieter, and the silence frightened him. One day, his voice disappeared completely. He could no longer speak. The illness had taken away his ability to share his thoughts. It could have been the end of his career. It could have been the moment he stopped. But Stephen Hawking never stopped. Technology saved him. A special computer was created, designed just for him. A small switch on his wheelchair allowed him to select words, letter by letter. A robotic voice read them out loud. It was slow, mechanical, unnatural, but it was his voice now. And through it, the world could still hear him. At first, people were surprised. The voice did not match the man. It was cold, electronic, without emotion. But soon, it became part of him. It became his identity. It was Stephen Hawking's voice, and it was powerful. He used it to teach. He used it to write. He used it to inspire. His books reached millions. His speeches were heard by students, scientists, world leaders. He appeared on television. He spoke in documentaries. His voice, though artificial, carried ideas that were larger than life. People listened. They admired him, not just for his intelligence, but for his strength. He had been given a short time to live, yet he refused to let that define him. Decades had passed since his diagnosis. He had built a career, a legacy, a name that would never be forgotten. His wheelchair did not limit him. His robotic voice did not hold him back. Instead, they became symbols of his fight. Proof that the human mind could overcome any obstacle. Proof that the spirit of discovery could never be silenced. He was more than a scientist now. He was an icon, and his journey was far from over. Chapter 7. A Brief History of Time. The world was fascinated by the universe. People looked up at the stars and wondered, what was out there? How did it all begin? Where did time come from? These were the questions Stephen had spent his life trying to answer. But science was not easy to understand. Equations, theories, complex ideas. Most people struggled to follow them. Stephen wanted to change that. He wanted everyone to share in the wonder of discovery. He had an idea, a book that would explain the universe to everyone, not just scientists, not just professors, but ordinary people, people who had never studied physics, people who had never read about black holes, time, and space, a book that would open the doors of science to the world. Writing was not easy. His illness made it harder. Every sentence took time. Every word was chosen carefully. He used his computer to form each thought, letter by letter. It was slow, it was difficult. But he never stopped. Page by page, the book took shape. He wrote about the beginning of the universe, the nature of time, the mysteries of black holes. He asked big questions. Could time run backward? Would the universe ever end? Was there a beginning to everything? He explained these ideas in a way that anyone could understand. Simple, clear, no difficult math, just the beauty of science, told like a story. When the book was finished, he had no idea what would happen. Would people read it? Would they care? He hoped, but he was not sure. Then something incredible happened. The book was published, and it changed everything. A Brief History of Time was not just a science book. It became a phenomenon. It sold millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. People all over the world read it. Students, teachers, doctors, musicians, even people who had never studied science before. They read it on buses, in cafes, at home. They talked about it. They debated its ideas. Stephen was no longer just a scientist. He was a superstar. His name was known across the world. He appeared on television. He gave interviews. People lined up to hear him speak. His robotic voice became famous. His wheelchair, his computer, his brilliant mind. He was an icon of science and determination. The book brought him closer to people. Strangers wrote to him. They thanked him. They told him how the book had changed the way they saw the universe. Some said it had changed the way they saw life itself. He had done something extraordinary. He had taken the most complex ideas in science and made them clear, simple, and beautiful. Years passed, and the book continued to sell. It became one of the most popular science books ever written. It inspired a new generation of thinkers, dreamers, and scientists. People who looked up at the night sky and felt for the first time that they understood a little more about what was out there. He had proved something important. Science was not just for the few, it was for everyone. And the story of the universe was far from over. Chapter 8. Overcoming the Impossible. The doctors had been wrong. They had given him 2 years, but 2 years passed, then 5, then 10. Stephen Hawking refused to give up. His body weakened, but his mind grew stronger. The illness could not take away his curiosity, his passion, his need to explore. He continued to work, to think, to challenge the limits of what was possible. He gave lectures to packed halls, though he could no longer speak without his computer. His voice was slow, robotic, but people listened. They hung on every word. His ideas were too important to ignore. Traveling became harder, but he did not stop. He visited countries around the world. He met kings, presidents, and scientists. He shared his knowledge with students, researchers, and dreamers. Everywhere he went, people were inspired. If he could achieve so much despite his struggles, what excuse did anyone else have? His wheelchair was not a prison. It was his chariot. It carried him through life, pushing him forward when his body could not. He was not limited. He was not trapped. He was free. And then something incredible happened. He had always studied the universe. He had dreamed about space, black holes, the mysteries beyond Earth. But he had never left the ground. He had never floated in zero gravity. Until one day, he got the chance. A special flight. A plane designed to create weightlessness. For a few moments, passengers could experience what astronauts felt in space. It was something most people would never try. But Stephen? He said yes. Doctors worried. His condition was serious. The risk was high. But he wanted to feel it, to experience what he had spent his life studying. And so, they lifted him from his wheelchair. They carried him onto the plane. They secured him in place. And then, they let go. For the first time in decades, he was free from his chair. He floated, no weight, no pain, no limits, just the feeling of being unchained from gravity itself. He laughed, his face filled with joy. In that moment, he was not a man with ALS. He was an explorer, touching the edge of space. It was proof of what he had always believed. Nothing is impossible. The human spirit can overcome anything. His journey continued. He wrote more books. He gave more speeches. His ideas continued to shape the way people thought about time, space, and the universe. He was more than a scientist. He was a symbol of strength, of determination, of hope. People often asked him how he did it, how he kept going, how he never lost his love for life. His answer was always the same. However difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. He lived by those words, and because of him, millions of others did too. The world watched in awe. His body had limits. His mind had none. And still, he was not finished. Chapter 9. The final chapter. The world stood still. The news spread quickly, from one country to another, from one person to the next. Stephen Hawking had passed away. It was hard to believe. He had defied time for so long, fought against the odds, pushed beyond every limit. And yet, the moment had come. His journey had been extraordinary, born in war, challenged by illness, defined by brilliance. He had once been given 2 years to live, yet he had lived for more than 5 decades beyond that. Not just lived, thrived. He had explored the universe without ever leaving Earth. He had reshaped science, rewritten what was possible, and inspired millions. His wheelchair sat empty, a symbol of the struggle he had endured, but also of the strength he had shown. His voice, robotic yet full of wisdom, would never speak again. But his words, his ideas, they would never fade. People from all over the world shared their grief. Scientists, world leaders, students, ordinary people, everyone felt the loss. He had been more than a physicist. He had been a voice of hope, a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the human mind has no limits. On the day of his passing, something remarkable happened. It was March 14th, a date known to mathematicians as Pi Day, a celebration of numbers, of infinite possibilities. And it was also the birthday of Albert Einstein, the genius who had inspired Stephen as a child. Some called it coincidence. Others called it fate. But for those who had followed his life, it felt like a poetic ending. His family spoke of him with love. His children remembered a father who never let his illness define him, who joked, who laughed, who believed in the impossible. They knew he was gone, but they also knew he would never truly leave. At Cambridge, where he had studied, where he had worked, where his mind had soared, the bells of Great St. Mary's Church rang in his honor. A farewell to the man who had looked beyond the stars, who had searched for the answers to the greatest questions of the universe. His ashes were laid to rest in Westminster Abbey between two other great minds, Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. The past, the present, and the future of science united in one place. But his legacy was not in stone. It was in the minds of those he had touched, in the books he had written, in the discoveries he had made. His words continued to echo. Look up at the stars, not down at your feet. Be curious. However difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do. And so, the story of Stephen Hawking did not end. Because every time someone looks up at the night sky, wondering about the mysteries of the universe, every time a student opens a book and dreams of understanding more, every time a person faces an impossible challenge and refuses to give up, he is still there. Chapter 10. The Legacy Lives On. The night sky stretched above, vast and full of mysteries. The same stars that Stephen Hawking had looked up at as a child still shone, still whispered their secrets. His voice, though silent now, still spoke through the pages of his books, the words in his lectures, the theories he left behind. His journey had ended, but his impact would never fade. Scientists around the world continued his work. His ideas on black holes, space, and time still shaped modern physics. His discoveries were not forgotten. They were stepping stones for future minds. Researchers studied Hawking radiation, tested his theories, searched for answers to the questions he had asked. His dream of understanding the universe did not die with him. It lived on, in the hands of those who dared to look beyond the ordinary. But his influence was not limited to science. His story, his strength, his refusal to surrender to illness inspired millions. He had shown the world that the mind had no boundaries, that even in the face of the impossible, a person could achieve greatness. His life was proof that limits exist only if we accept them. Students in classrooms across the globe read his books. His words reached not just scientists, but everyday people, those who had never studied physics before. He had made the universe understandable. He had opened the doors of science to everyone. His book, A Brief History of Time, continued to sell, continued to ignite curiosity in young minds. A book written by a man who could barely move, barely speak, yet whose voice reached across generations. His robotic voice had once sounded strange to the world. Now it was iconic. Documentaries, interviews, recordings. His voice still echoed, still told the story of the cosmos. He had once feared losing his ability to communicate. Instead, his words became immortal. The wheelchair that carried him through life was more than a machine. It was a symbol of his fight, a reminder that weakness of the body did not mean weakness of the spirit, that even as his muscles failed, his thoughts soared. He had turned his greatest challenge into his greatest strength. Young people facing difficulties looked to him for hope. Those battling illness found courage in his journey. His name was spoken not just in universities, but in homes, hospitals, and schools. He had become more than a scientist. He had become a beacon of resilience. He had once dreamed of space. Though he never traveled there, his ideas did. NASA honored him. Astronomers used his work to explore the edges of the cosmos. His theories shaped the way scientists understood black holes and the fabric of time itself. One of his final wishes was to send his voice into space, a message carried by radio waves traveling beyond our planet. A final goodbye to the stars he had loved so much, a reminder that though he was gone, his spirit was eternal. People still remembered him. They remembered the man who had defied the odds, the man who had outlived every expectation, the man who had never let his illness define him. His humor, his intelligence, his determination, these things did not disappear. His children carried his memory. His students carried his lessons. The world carried his name. One day, far in the future, when scientists finally solve the mysteries he spent his life studying, they will look back and know he was the one who helped them get there. His story had begun with a young boy who loved the stars. It ended with a man who had touched the universe. But in truth, his story did not end at all. Because every time someone looks up at the night sky, wondering, questioning, dreaming, Stephen Hawking lives on.